I'm back. Okay, so from my first video, I told you that my grandmother's is a bit short. Okay, so my grandmother grew up in Calabria, Italy. She lived there until she was about 11 and then moved to Manhattan. My grandma was a New York City girl. It's funny. Get this. Okay, so my grandmother has a younger brother. His name is Vinny, but we call him Jimmy. And then my grandmother has a younger sister. Her name is Frances. We call her Frances. Okay? Her parents is what we refer to them as Jimmy's mama and Jimmy's papa. Okay? These are my great-grandparents. And this is similar to my grandfather's story. Jimmy is my grandmother's brother, obviously. And we say Jimmy's mama, Jimmy's papa, whatever. My family makes up these interesting things. So anyway, let me tell you about my grandmother. My grandmother came to the United States. She moved to New York City. She was around 10, 11 years old. She was actually held back in school a year because she didn't speak English that well. So she was held back in school. My grandmother went to school until she completed high school, and then she went to beauty school. My grandmother is a fabulous, if you saw my grandmother walking the street, and I will vouch for this, my grandmother does not look her age. She does not look like a grandmother. And she is hip and going with it, okay? She's only 68. Yeah, she's 68. She wears her little Nikes. She has her Michael Kors watch. She walks around with her cute bag. She's with it 120,000%, okay? So there's that. My grandmother speaks Italian, obviously, and she speaks English. However, when she came to the United States at 11 years old, she wanted nothing to do with her Italian background at all. She wanted to fit in and assimilate into the American quote-unquote culture. She changed her name from Maria to Marie. And Maria is when you hear the name Marie, you don't say, oh, that girl's from Europe. Her name's Maria. She's from Italy. No. She could be from Eastern Europe. She could be from Western Europe. She could be from South America. She could be from, I wouldn't say Asia, but she could be from anywhere. She could be from anywhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be Italian. But my grandmother thought that. And she wanted nothing to do with her Italian heritage whatsoever. Okay? And my grandmother, and it's funny because when my mom and my aunt were born, my grandmother still wanted nothing to do with her Italian heritage. She cooked Italian, yes, because my grandfather eats Italian food. But she didn't really instill it in her kids. My mother's name is Stella. Stella after her grandmother on her father's side, which is the respectful thing to do in Italian culture. It is. But my grandmother's not a disrespectful person. But her second daughter's name is Christine. Christine is not an Italian name whatsoever. And she did that purposely because she didn't want her daughter to be affiliated with that Italian culture. Okay? Her first daughter's name is Stella because it was respectful to do. Okay? So my grandmother really didn't emphasize, my Aunt Frances on the other hand didn't really emphasize that Italian background that we had. The only reason my mom learned to speak Italian was because she lived with my grandmother, my great-grandmother for a while, especially when my grandfather was in the Air Force. She learned Italian through her great-grandmother, and she hung around her great-grandmother, and she didn't really speak English, okay? My Aunt Christine learned less Italian than my mother. However, she does know Italian. Her husband's from Italy. So she learned later in life. My mom learned in her early age. And it stuck with her because she continued it in school and she continued to practice. But my grandmother did not speak Italian in the home, wanted nothing to do with it. So that's a little bit about my grandmother. She was very into that American dream lifestyle, the 2.5 kids. My grandmother was very domestic. She used to make gourmet, she still does, but she made gourmet meals for everybody in the household. She made gourmet lunches for my mother and my aunt when they went to school. My mother always says, my friends were always jealous of my lunches. It was the 1970s and I used to have hot thermos and cold thermos. I used to have soup and Swedish meatballs. Like, who goes to school with that? So that's how my mother grew up. And my grandmother always stayed with it. She was always very hip, I would say. And you know what? I affiliate that value with my grandma. She always was contemporary. You know what? That's what I'll say for her. She's very contemporary. She keeps up with the time. She keeps herself going. She always looks presentable. She doesn't look like a grandmother. Just a funny side note about my grandmother. So when I was doing this origin project, this is totally like on the other side. I asked my grandma the first thing. I said, Grandma, I was like, do you have anything funny you can tell me about like the family, or like, do you have anything like skeletons in the closet like that I wouldn't know about? And she was like, well, my father came to the United States first, like 4 years before my mother did, so before my great grandmother. And she goes, he probably had a girlfriend. I think that, like, how do you go 4 years without a woman? He probably had another family on the side. So this was the first thing my grandmother told me. Then the second thing was, Graham, anything like you never told me that you did as a kid? She goes, yeah. She goes, I wanted to go to the movies when I was younger. I was only 11 years old. So I used to go around the neighborhood and collect money and say it was for St. Anthony's. Who does that? I go, Grandma, my grandmother's a good person, good lady, really nice. And I go, Graham, why'd you do that? I go, what are you, a schemer? And she goes, yeah, and she laughed. She goes, I wouldn't do that now. And I was like, I would hope not. So my grandmother's a very comical person. She's like very truthful, and she always means well. She doesn't hide anything, obviously. Like I said, I would call her contemporary. She has like that contemporary vibe about her. It's a little bit about my grandmother. She's a great woman, extremely generous. We'll get the shirt off her back for you. Her parents too were hardworking. My grandmother was very hardworking, but didn't have those values like my grandfather did. My grandfather has that hard work ethic, and to this day, my grandmother tells my grandfather to retire, and he refuses to do so. That's just it. Okay. So that's a little bit about my grandmother's story.